Frightened for no reason or for every reason. Sometimes the fear of what might happen that makes us panic. Today we examine the psychology of terror here on Roundtable. Welcome to the programme. I'm David Foster. The aim of a terrorist is simply to terrify. Of course, there may be other reasons besides that, but that is one of the justifications. But what if we are mostly just jumping at shadows? What if it is concern over what might happen, not what actually takes place, that is the most concerning aspect of life in the 21st century?
Our war on terror begins with Al-Qaeda, but it does not end there.
Take this very firm stand against terrorism.
Terrorism and the supposed prevalence of terrorists has shaped political discourse for much of the 21st century.
This attempted act of terrorism,
an act of pure terror.
The so-called war on terror has left us confronted by fear in the everyday.
You're letting people come in from terrorist nations.
A pervasive sense of danger that has affected the way we communicate, travel, and work. Has the notion of everyday terrorism affected us in ways we haven't yet realized? Are we living in a state of fear? The sight of terrified people fleeing through the streets has become all too common in European cities. Last month, the British capital saw similar scenes. Crowds of people in a busy shopping area believed they were running for their lives, but there was no actual threat. Panic spread as rumours circulated and police arrived. The Western response to this sense of fear can be seen in the changing face of towns and cities. Militarized police have become a prominent feature. Security barriers line roads and herd pedestrians. And an increasing number of security cameras and recording equipment monitor public spaces. France has been in a state of emergency since 2015, when an attack on its capital left more than 130 people dead. In the United States, terrorism and the sources of it have become grounds to alter migration and refugee policy.
And if you remember, ISIS said, we are going to infiltrate the United States and other countries through the migration. And then we're not allowed to be tough on the people coming in?
But what is the lasting psychological impact of terror attacks? And is the threat of terror actually worse than the reality?
Well, we're joined via Skype from Kent by Frank Furedi, who's written a book called The Culture of Fear. He's also a Professor of Sociology at the University of Kent. In the studio with me at the round table, we have a researcher in violent terrorism and security policy, that is Dennis Wecker. We have Lucy Beresford, a broadcaster and psychotherapist, and Mirren Gidda, a journalist who's been specialising in terrorism, security and crime, writing about it. That is Mirren. Thank you all for coming to Roundtable today. Frank, let me ask you about The Culture of Fear, your book. How do you define what is the culture?
I think it's got to do with the fact that when we face uncertainty or when we look at the future, we increasingly expect the worst possible outcomes. And virtually all dimensions of human experience in Western societies now comes with a health warning. And as a result of that, we as human beings have become to some extent accustomed to reacting or overreacting to what is often very ordinary, normal existential problems. And one of the things that I've noticed is that whereas we often talk about the big scary stuff like global terrorism or global warming or major epidemics, we also seem to have very similar reactions to strangers, to the dark, to going to strange places. We're really scared about the future of our children. And we now live in a world where we're so worried about young people that we literally immunize them from the experience of everyday life, just in case they might come to some harm.
Let me put that to you, Lucy, because you try and look into people's minds.
Yeah.
It's a society of scaredy cats, but for a valid reason or an invalid one?
Well, certainly anthropologically, you have to remember that we were primed to survive. So a lot of our responses are based on that survival instinct. And also our brain works on the basis of probable accuracy, not perfect accuracy. So we've trained ourselves over time to respond to snap judgment. So for example, if we see dozens of people running in a particular direction, and in the case of a couple of weeks ago at Oxford Circus Tube, if you imagine that all these people must be right, we're going to follow them, because to do the opposite.
Or I'm not going to be the only one that's wrong.
I don't want to be the only kid in the playground not playing marbles. I don't want to be the only person standing around while everyone else gets to safety.
Yeah, do you think all of this has changed in recent years? Dennis, you first.
Of course, from what we have seen over the last couple of years, and by that I also mean the same types of attacks, you know, vehicle attacks, knife attacks. There's something that has been branded in our heads already. Whenever we see someone run away, we hear somebody scream maybe in a public place, we automatically assume that it might be the worst that is taking place right now.
And are we right to assume that?
That is very subjective, obviously.
What was it? I was reading this morning. 300,000 people shot dead in the US between 2005 and 2015. 94 people died in terror attacks. And yet the second biggest fear in the United States is being a victim of a terror attack, not being hit by a car.
The trouble is, if you have a one-off event, then you can actually rationalise that to yourself and say, this is a one-off event, it might have happened overseas, it's not going to affect me. The more it happens, the more it becomes an ongoing threat, and your anxiety levels will just increase. So at some kind of trigger point, you will think, okay, this is what I've been primed for, I'm going to react.
What is...
Let me just bring you in, if I may, and ask you, as somebody who writes about these subjects, are we, the media, guilty of fueling people's insecurities? Do you ever wonder about that?
Yes, I do, because, I mean, you often see people tweeting, why don't you report that if you cross the road, you're at much greater risk of dying than you are in a terrorist attack? And obviously, we greatly magnify terrorist attacks, but people don't think that pragmatically. You don't think, well, you know, gunshot victims are in a greater number than terrorist victims. If something like the Paris attacks happen, they are going to dominate the news coverage, and then you're going to think, well, that could have been me. And the other thing is, politicians are also saying, this is the new normal. And that's sort of adding to this like climate.
Let's get into that in a minute. Dennis, you wanted to jump in,
Yeah.
and then Frank, we'll come back to you in just a second if you
A
can.
few points, and that's exactly the bias that you can watch by, you know, when you watch the media and how they report on terrorism, obviously you get the impression that this is happening every week, every month. If the media would do the same thing with car accidents, you would probably have a different perception of it. And to pick up on your point that you made earlier, what is very interesting to observe in France, in Paris, for example, since they had a lot of attacks, and they have a special counter-terrorism program in place called Plan Vigie Pirate, where they have put soldiers everywhere in the streets, and you get checked when you enter a mall. And now what happened is, since the French are surrounded by these counter-terrorism efforts day in and out, they've sort of come accustomed to it, and they don't really notice it anymore. Yeah. So that is also a very interesting observation.
It becomes the new normal.
Yeah, let's bring in Frank, because it's difficult for you to jump in, I know, when you're on Skype. Do you think things have changed very much in recent years with, as we're discussing here, the coverage that these sort of events get, the anticipation of something horrible happening? Something's changed in our mind?
I think it has, but there's one point that we should always remember, which is all the research shows that intentionally imposed risks, such as terrorism, or, for example, letting a virus go online, are much more scary to people than the unintended consequences of, for example, a car accident or something in that area. So all the research indicates that people are particularly scared of intentionally imposed threats, and also of intentionally imposed threats that are random. And I think it's the random quality of terrorism that people are really worried about.
Yeah.
The fact is, it can happen to anybody. And I think that's been the very important factor in the reactions that we're now getting in many European capitals.
Yeah, you see, I have a note here that says unpredictability, uncertainty, lack of knowledge inflates risk perception. So it's the fact that we're not really sure what's round the corner, that we don't know when it could happen, that it happened to those strangers there,
We're very afraid of the unknown in general.
Yeah.
So you think about when you're on a train and it isn't going, everybody starts to get quite agitated until somebody comes on the tannoy and explains what the delay is about, and suddenly everybody's anxiety levels drop.
Well, I don't know, sometimes you just go, oh, not again.
Yeah, but that's because you're on a British railway system. But if you are in a terrorist situation and you don't know what the deal is, and that's where social media can be both a boon but also can be an adversary, and this is what, I think we saw in Oxford Circus, is that people were hungry for information. They were afraid because they weren't getting it. So they were turning to the only source that they felt they had.
And a very well-known person happened to be caught up in it.
And a celebrity says, oh gosh, I've heard shots. And suddenly they become a world authority on the event, when in fact, no, we're reaching out to the wrong sources for our information.
Now, the terrorists, sorry to butt in, the terrorists obviously have a reason for doing what they do, however twisted it may be, but do authorities, governments, have a reason to keep us frightened as well? Because A, it means we have to place our trust in them a little bit more, and secondly, it keeps people more alert.
Policymakers obviously have made use of fear over and over again everywhere in the world. I don't want to call anybody out here, but yes, that has been used as for policymaking, obviously, in the past. But when you look into terrorist strategy, you can see that terrorists make use of this unpredictability. Obviously, that is their strategy on the one hand, but counterterrorism forces, lawmakers, obviously also use this, and they try to minimize the risk here. Whenever you're at a rail station or in a public space, you might not see these little things, but it's, you know, transparent bin bags, for example, that you can see in the London Tube, so that you can see whether there is a suspicious item in it. Increased CCTV and all these little things that have been put into place to reduce this unpredictability. So there is something that can be done, and obviously you need to analyze the patterns to make the unpredictable more predictable.
I think the irony is that for a lot of terrorists, government overreaction can sometimes be what they want. Because if you have, as we see with France, armed police on the streets and armed vehicles everywhere, it looks like the government has possibly lost control, or at the very least is afraid. And for terrorists who, it's asymmetric warfare, their resources are considerably less than the resources of a state. But if they can get armed police on the streets, it makes them look like they are a formidable threat. So I think governments have to be careful. They have to be protecting citizens, but also not overreacting to the situation.
Yeah. Frank, can I just go to Frank? Sorry, you wanted to say something, Frank?
Yeah, I think Britain has been, and the British governments in general, have been reasonably good on this score. If you compare the reaction of the government in Britain compared to Belgium or France, where they've or Germany for that matter, where they cancelled football matches, where they put loads and loads of soldiers on the street, I think in England in particular, we had a very low-key profile, which I think has worked quite well. I think what has happened within the British context, where the real problem has emerged, is not so much the government overreaction or the government playing the fear card, but the fact that within the British context, the social media and public sort of opinion has almost embraced terrorism as part of its own repertoire of everyday life. And what we have in London and what we had in Oxford was an absolutely classic case of a performance of fear, where people are using the social media saying, I'm here, I'm scared. People going on Facebook saying, oh, I'm safe, everything is all right. And all this social media activity actually works towards creating a subliminal climate of terror.
See, I'm thinking back to the early 80s when we had the IRA bombings in London. And yes, people talked about them. Yes, they were on the front pages of the newspaper. But it is the rumour mill now, isn't it? It's much, much bigger and much more able to sort of scare people. than it ever was there.
But also, again, I think you're right. But it was also very contained then. Okay, so there were some bombings in Birmingham as well at the time, but a lot of it was mainly carried out. If it carried out on the mainland at all, it was mainly in London. And now, again, through enhanced social media, but also just in terms of our global village, we know what happened in Paris, we know what happened in Manchester, we know what happened with the Twin Towers in New York. Suddenly, it's a much smaller world where you know all of these events that are happening. And as Mirren said, it makes you feel like this could happen to me as well.
But it also serves to make people feel safe. You can mark yourself safe on social media sites. The fact that you can talk to somebody and you know that they haven't been hurt.
Well, living is a group
There's certain
activity.
phlegm, you know, the British sort of steadfastness comes through in some of this. Is there a way we can turn it around and make it work for ourselves?
Well, it's definitely that Dunkirk spirit of, you know, we're not going to be cowed, we're not going to change our daily routine just because the terrorists are trying to create a climate of fear. So there is a support network that speaks volumes of how we want to connect as human beings and won't let terrorism give in. But unfortunately, ultimately, our survival instinct will mean that we will be very alert to threats to our survival, and we will respond to those in the instant and maybe only reflect on it later.
Yeah, and you see it on the underground as well. There are signs up now saying, if you see suspicious behaviour, report it. I can't remember the catchy slogan.
See it, say it, sorted.
That's it. But it's like, you know, what is suspicious behaviour? You're basically being asked to be on a state of high alert and to make a value judgment as a member of the public of what is suspicious and to report it. So,
Well, so you might not want to make a fuss.
well, it's not so much make fuss, but I mean, how do you know what is worthy of being reported and what isn't?
It's there is that conflict, I think, sometimes between political correctness or not offending somebody and your own survival instinct, and when does one trump the other?
I mean, you probably don't know any particular terrorists, but in your study of terrorism, do they get frustrated when people seem to just, as that old wartime poster had it in this country, keep calm and carry on?
No, I wouldn't say they get frustrated, nor am I really in a position to speak for any terrorists.
No, but you study their motives, motivation.
Yeah. No, but what you can observe is that when they think about their target, they often get frustrated and pick a target that is sometimes less attractive. So that is something very interesting that you can observe. And I remember also a case from the 90s in London where an individual planted a couple of bombs in London. And to pick up on your point that you made earlier, he built the IED, the improvised explosive device, and wanted to explode it in a gay bar. But he failed to do so and went outside and just planted it between two vans. And a member of the public observed this and was wondering what this big this big parcel is. And he consecutively alerted the police, and they were able to put it in a trunk within a few minutes where it exploded. So this is where it comes in handy to be alert and watch what is going on.
So it is necessary to some extent to be in a state of apprehension.
It is, yeah. And also when we talk about the government and is it overreacting in terms of putting police forces out in the street, we all remember the London Bridge attack. And what was very remarkable here was that the Metropolitan Police responded within 5 to 7 minutes, and that was only because there was increased police forces on the ground. Now imagine that wouldn't have been the case, a lot more lives would have been lost.
Frank, you're nodding, so give us your thoughts on what's being said so far, and then I want to ask you a question.
Well, I think that at the end of the day, the key thing that governments can do is to ensure that they're trusted. And if they are going to be trusted, they need to have a more proactive policy towards the public. I think it's wrong that the public is seen in a very passive way. They need to be not just simply given the task of reporting, but they also need to be made to feel kind of responsible, have a certain sense of duty towards the welfare of their community. And I think that's the key challenge in most European societies. My main concern at the moment is that the public tends to react not just in a survivalist kind of mode, but in a very passive, almost narcissistic way. I remember seeing all these pictures at the time of the Westminster Bridge attack, where you had all these people taking selfies saying, I'm here, I'm there. people almost taking pictures of themselves in the middle of all this panic that was going on, and not really realizing that something very important was happening. And they too had a responsibility in those circumstances to play a particular role. And that's, I think, is the key message that the government's got to get across in our society.
I'll come back to you, Frank, with my question in just a minute. But looking at this and sort of agreeing that a certain state of wariness is necessary, and it's been inculcated into us by events we've seen, would it be better to get rid of that and feel more relaxed, or are we going to have to live with this from now on in?
I think at the moment we're going to have to live with it, and not least because, as Dennis said, there is a positive side to it, which is that if you are drawing people in to be part of the solution, you're giving them the responsibility to be able to say you could help change things. If you're alert, if you're vigilant, if you inform us of what you see, then you could foil a terrorist attack, and that would be amazing. So people want to feel that they could be part of the solution, but what you'll never get rid of is that instinct to survive at all costs, and it's been hardwired into our system for so long that whether it's through social media or whether it's just on day-to-day interaction, that is going to be our default setting.
And I think we need to look at the specific threat, which is it's ISIS-inspired terrorism predominantly, and we know that the Islamic State has been saying to its followers, stay at home and carry out attacks, and you can use whatever you want for the attacks, be it cars or knives, and we know that they're looking to attack soft targets, so people just in cafes or at London Bridge. So I think we do need to be wary, because we know from our politicians and from our security forces that there will be more attacks, and I think it's about striking that balance between being wary and reporting it and not panicking.
And the fact, Dennis, that they are choosing soft targets makes every one of us at this table more likely to think, oh, it could be me, rather than it's going to be a high-ranking member of the judiciary or somebody in government. This is a policy that's changed, isn't it?
Very, very much so, and especially because the security detail, as it is called, on high-profile targets has been increased over the last couple of years, and terrorists don't necessarily pick high-profile targets anymore and pick soft targets, as you say, because they're more unprotected.
So they are easier targets, and also the effect can be greater.
The effect obviously can be greater when you want to create fear. And what I would like to see from policymakers or from different governments is not a short-term reaction like we have seen since 9/11 basically, but a more long-term strategy. And since we have a psychologist here on the table, I think it's crucial to understand the actual behavior of terrorists to dismantle it. And therefore we need to put much more funding and resources into understanding what is happening between someone decides to be radicalized and actually conducting an attack. And that is something that we have not fully understood
You were
yet.
sort of suggesting you approve with what he said.
Absolutely,
yeah?
I would totally agree with it, but it would be a very long-term strategy, because the psychology of each individual, there are certain themes in terms of dissatisfaction, disaffection, rebellion, or just longing for some form of identity, and an exceptionally warped view of the normal search for identity that takes place in adolescence, for example, where we all start to kind of identify with pop stars or sports stars. This is a warping of that same very natural process. That's the worry, is that actually it's a natural process that's just been warped.
But, Frank, coming back to you, you wrote, the only thing we have to fear is the culture of fear itself.
Yes, I mean, I think that one of the big problems that we're confronted with is that we've learned how to scare ourselves, and in many dimensions of everyday life, we continually surround ourselves with warnings that are quite unnecessary. You go to a toy shop and you buy a toy for your child, and it gives you a 1001 reason as to what kind of bad side effects that particular toy could have. You then kind of carry on, you go to a swimming pool, and you're told that you must walk this way, otherwise you'll slip and fall. And if we're continually being surrounded by symbols of fear, then we naturally become socialized to react in an extremely insecure way. So there's nothing wrong with fearing. What is a problem is when we fear in a way that is no longer dominated by a probabilistic way of outlook, where we kind of have a probabilistic analysis of what is problem, what isn't. Fearing today is based upon a possibilistic approach where we assume that everything that can possibly go wrong will go wrong. And I think that kind of attitude towards fear becomes extremely unhelpful, and it creates a situation where even the police and even the army become risk averse to the point at which they become less able to be effective.
Look, we don't have very much time, so I'm going to ask Mirren to wrap this one up. What Frank says is logical, but you can also then run the risk of, if you're warned about everything, you're frightened of nothing.
Yeah, and I think with the very specific threat of terrorism, because that's primarily what we've been focused on, fear is important because I think a little bit of fear will be what keeps us safe. It will mean that we report things, that we are more alert to the risk. And, you know, I would sort of wrap up on a more positive note, which is I do think that while people are afraid, people are also incredibly resilient. You know, I was in Paris and Brussels immediately after those attacks, and the cities bounce back. You know, people go back to work, people go about their daily lives, and as much as we see fear in people running, we also see tremendous acts of bravery.
They haven't won, in other words.
Yes.
Thank you all very much indeed. Frank, thank you for joining us. I know you've got to run off to do some other TV stuff, but appreciate your time. You've been watching Roundtable, the psychology of terror. Thanks for watching this programme. I hope you're back for the next one. I'm David Foster from me and the team. Bye-bye.